My name is Lena Carter. I'm 26 years old and live in a tiny dorm room on the fourth floor of the graduate housing complex. A place where the golden light seeping out from windows on late nights often reminds me of the untold stories of hundreds of young people struggling toward their dreams. One of them, a girl pursuing a master's degree in psychology, scraping together every dollar from my cashier job at Merrow's Market to pay for tuition, textbooks, rent, and a little sliver of hope for the future. My shift today started at 9 a.m. Some people didn't show up, some came in late, and then there was me. Always on time, always getting the job done, always smiling even when my hands were aching after scanning, bagging, and greeting customers hundreds of times. Some say I'm too obedient. Others think I'm stubborn and don't know how to ask for more. But no one really understands the feeling of walking straight from a lecture on personality disorders to slipping into a green uniform and standing behind a counter, repeating the same line. Hi there. What can I help you with today? I've learned how to read people's emotions through their eyes, their words, even their silence. But I've also learned to silence myself, to keep from crying when someone shouts, to stay calm when a customer slams their hand on the counter because we've run out of a product. Today was no different. The store was packed. Not for any special reason, just your typical Friday rush before the weekend. Each minute dragged along in the monotonous rhythm of scan, bag, smile, repeat. I remember the moment the clock hit 9:01 p.m., less than an hour left in my shift. I began counting down in my head like I always do. Every customer meant one closer to the end. 49, 48, 47. No one saw my hands tremble under the register. No one saw the blur in my eyes after 11 hours without pause. No one heard the growl in my stomach after a delayed lunch at 4 p.m. and a forgotten dinner. I whispered to myself, just a little more, Lena. Almost there. Then came the sound of the shift bell. Ping. My personal liberation symphony. I took off my name tag, removed my uniform, punched out. Like a well-rehearsed ritual. I didn't walk out the doors with relief. Instead, I felt hollow, like stepping out of a blurry dream where I couldn't even be myself. As I made my way through the parking lot, I took a deep breath. The night air was cold, but somehow less so than the weight I carried on my shoulders. The light outside the store flickered. Maybe it had been broken since yesterday or longer. I couldn't remember anymore. I thought I'd left the weariness behind until a harsh voice snapped from behind me. Where the F** are you going? The line is insane. I froze. My body reacted before my mind. I turned around. A large, middle-aged man, face flushed with anger, was pointing at me like I was the reason his world had crumbled. In that instant I felt caught between two lives. On one side, the grad student chasing noble ideals of healing and understanding. On the other, the exhausted cashier, reduced to an emotional punching bag by a stranger. I wanted to ignore him. Walk away. But my feet didn't move. Not out of fear but anger. Anger at how people like me are dismissed. How all our effort, patience, and endurance could be wiped away by a single disrespectful comment. I replied as calmly as I could, but firmly. They're trying their best, sir. I've clocked out and I'm heading home. I don't know if my voice shook, but I'm sure my heart was pounding. Then he yelled again. You should stay until the line has been cleared. Something in me broke. Not from rage, but from a deep aching sense of injustice. I turned around fully, exhaled slowly. My eyes met his. And in that quiet flash of a moment, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. The man stared at me as if I'd just insulted something sacred. His eyes were brimming with judgment, his lips tightly pressed together, and his voice, sharp with entitlement. You should stay until the line is taken care of. People are still waiting, and you just walk away like it's not your problem. I stood tall, steadying my breath, meeting his gaze. Maybe to him I was just a young cashier who didn't know her place. Maybe he thought I didn't understand what it meant to be responsible. But I did. More than he knew. I just finished a 12-hour shift, sir, I said, my voice calm but unwavering. I believe I've done my part. Everyone still working inside is doing the best they can. There was no edge in my tone. No spite. Just a gentle reminder that we are human. But for people like him, those who believe they're always entitled to more, any form of pushback feels like disrespect. You think that matters? He snapped. How long you've worked has nothing to do with it. If you can't handle it, maybe you should go to college and get a real job instead of standing here whining. I paused, not because his words hurt me but because they sounded painfully familiar. I had heard those exact words before, from my father to my mother. Back when she worked in a small roadside diner, scraping together tips to raise me, he once sneered, "You think you're noble? Serving people like it's some kind of revolution." My mom stayed silent for days afterward. But I'm not my mother. And this isn't 1998. I clenched my fists, feeling something ancient and buried stir inside me. My voice, when it came again, was steady, firm, clear. Actually, I work here to pay for grad school. I'm about to get my master's in psychology. And honestly, sir, you're proving to be excellent material for my thesis. He blinked, frozen. I didn't stop there. I stepped slightly closer, not too close, just enough for the street lamp to fully illuminate my face. I didn't smile. I didn't scowl. I just spoke with the quiet power of someone who has spent years holding back. My thesis is on narcissistic behavior in public spaces. How some individuals use anger as a tool to regain a sense of control when they feel powerless. You're not only acting according to the theory, I'd say you're practically quoting it. I let the words settle. Some people think they're entitled to yell at staff because they're paying for a service. But the truth is that behavior usually reflects what's going on inside. Fear, insecurity, or simply a lack of self-regulation. I looked him dead in the eye. And I believe you're having a bad day. Maybe even a bad week. But I'm not the cause of that. Just like the woman at the next register isn't to blame because the customer ahead of you took too long. We are not your outlet. Silence. A stillness swept through the night. Somewhere down the street, a car horn honked. But in that moment, it felt like the world was holding its breath. I saw something shift in his expression. A crack. Small but enough for me to realize he wasn't just angry at me. He was angry at everything. At life. At himself. And just like I used to be angry at the world when my mother came home with tired eyes and empty hands after a day of serving customers who never learned her name. He turned away, muttering something under his breath. Then he shuffled back toward the long checkout line without another word. I didn't watch him go. I just stood there. And finally exhaled. As I walked toward my car, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel like I won that argument. Honestly, I wished it hadn't happened at all. I don't like using knowledge to shut people down. But sometimes you have to defend yourself, not with rage but with understanding. I thought about what my professor once said in class. Understanding others is a good thing. But maintaining compassion after you understand them, that's wisdom. I'm still learning that. And tonight I knew I'd taken one small step forward. I looked up at the sky. No stars. Just slow-moving clouds, drifting like my thoughts. Neither happy nor sad, just moving. My car was parked at the far end of the lot, under the shade of an old oak tree. I opened the door, slid into the driver's seat and let my hands rest on the steering wheel. Hands that had served over 300 customers that day. Hands that held back frustration. That didn't shake in the confrontation. And now, trembled slightly from exhaustion. I whispered to myself, "You did well, Lena. You did really well." I got back to the dorm just after 11 p.m. The building was quiet, unusually so. Maybe everyone was buried in textbooks, or perhaps they too were worn out after another week racing deadlines and paper submissions. I dropped my bag on the desk, kicked off my shoes and sank to the floor, leaning against the closed door. The soft light in my room cast warm, golden shapes across the tile floor. I didn't move. I didn't think. It felt like my mind had been emptied out, wrung dry from the confrontation earlier. But strangely, it wasn't the man who weighed on me. It was a memory. One I had buried for far too long, now rising slow and inevitable like the tide. I closed my eyes. And behind the darkness of my eyelids I saw her, my mother. Her silvering hair pulled back in a loose bun, her frail hands and that worn floral apron with little white daisies. My mother. The woman who taught me how to smile at the world even when the world never smiled back. I was born and raised in a small town in Missouri. My father, a man once considered charming around town, walked out when I was 8. He left my mother with a mountain of bank debt and one last cruel sentence. I can't live with someone who doesn't know how to rise above. She didn't cry. I remember that. She just gave a tired smile, walked into the kitchen, took down the wedding photo from the wall and placed it in an old wooden box. That night, I watched her sit by the window longer than usual, cradling a cup of cold tea, her eyes staring out at the empty backyard where I used to play on the swing. From that day forward, she never stopped working. She took on late shifts at a local diner, mopping floors, clearing dishes, sometimes even cooking for the regulars. People complimented her meatloaf, saying it tasted like it came out of a cookbook. But no one remembered her name. They called her the silver-haired waitress, or the sweet cleaning lady. I used to feel furious for her. Once when a customer yelled because their food was late, I, only 12 years old, stood up, pointed a finger and shouted, "You can't talk to my mom like that." My mother gently pulled me back to our seat. Later at home, she sat on the edge of my bed, brushed the hair from my forehead and said softly, "Sweetheart, there will always be people who think they have the right to yell. Not because they're bad, but because they're hurt. And if you yell back, you become hurt just like them. But if you keep your kindness, you are the strongest one of all." Back then, I didn't understand. I just thought the world didn't deserve someone as good as her. But as I grew older, I began to understand. I didn't choose psychology because of passion, at least not at first. I chose it because I wanted to understand my mother. I wanted to know how someone could endure so much and still look the world in the eye with gentleness. I remember the day I got my acceptance letter for grad school. I ran home like a little kid, waving the envelope in the air. I placed it on the kitchen table while she stirred a pot of soup. She wiped her hands on her apron, opened the letter and read it slowly. Then she looked at me, no tears, no smile, just a long, deep breath. "So you're leaving," she whispered. I grabbed her hand, holding back the lump in my throat. "I'm leaving to come back stronger, Mom. I'm going so I can become someone who heals." And she nodded, as she always did. No resistance. No guilt. Just trust. Now, sitting in my tiny apartment in the middle of a loud city, I finally understood why I couldn't stay silent forever. Because my mother had stayed silent her whole life. And I wanted to be the voice she never had. I opened my laptop. I scrolled through the draft of my thesis. Narcissistic Traits and the Impact of Social Environment on Control Behavior. A Practical Analysis. For the first time it felt wrong. Not because it wasn't academic enough, but because it no longer felt alive. It was sterile, cold, distant. It didn't reflect what I had lived through, what I had seen. It wasn't about the theory anymore. It was about life. It was about my mother. It was about me. It was about every person who had ever stood behind a register, in a kitchen, on a hospital floor. People labeled as the help instead of humans. I began to retype the introduction. I do not study narcissism to define it in a textbook. I write about it because I watched my mother wipe away silent tears after being demeaned. I write about it because I stood in a supermarket surrounded by people, facing a man who couldn't control the storm inside him. I write to listen and to no longer be silent. My fingers trembled slightly, but each word on the screen felt like a heartbeat returning to a frozen chest. It was 1:43 a.m. when I finally closed the laptop. I stepped out onto the balcony. The city lights still flickered in the distance. The wind was gentle, brushing past my face, carrying a scent both strange and familiar. Wet earth after rain and a soft trace of cinnamon, just like the sweater my mother used to wear. I closed my eyes and whispered into the night. Mom, I will never stay silent again. I will speak for you. With everything I've learned, lived, and carried. And I knew, even though she wasn't physically here, she could hear me. Because some connections don't need words. They only need love. The next morning, I arrived at campus earlier than usual. The air was crisp, the mist still lingering like a sheer veil over the old brick buildings of the university. Everything felt softer, slower. I walked into the office of Professor Mira Elwood, my thesis advisor, with hands slightly damp from the morning dew. She was a woman in her 60s, small in stature, but her voice carried like church bells. Most students feared her, because of her sharpness, her gaze that could pierce through weak arguments like glass. But I respected her for one simple reason: she was always honest. "Lena," she said, looking up from her papers. "Have a seat." I slid into the chair across from her and placed my newly revised thesis draft on her desk. She didn't rush to open it. She just studied me for a long moment. "I rewrote the introduction," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I want this thesis to reflect not just what I've studied, but what I've seen. What I've felt." She nodded slowly, then flipped through the pages. Her eyes scanned with practiced speed, but I could tell she was reading deeply. When she reached the section about the incident at the grocery store, she looked up. "You said that really happened?" I nodded. "And do you think," she asked, voice firm but quiet, "you're writing an academic thesis, or a personal memoir, Lena?" I paused. "I'm not blaming you," she continued, her voice surprisingly gentle. "But there's a thin line between observing and participating. A psychologist can't let personal emotions contaminate the data." I looked down at my hands, the ones still bearing faint calluses from the checkout counter. I understood what she meant. I understood all of it, with my mind. But my heart told a different story. "Professor," I said slowly, "I don't believe I've crossed that line. I wasn't reacting out of anger. I was protecting myself. And honestly, sometimes it's those personal experiences that give our research its meaning. They transform numbers and theories into something real." She stared at me for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled. "You're growing, Lena. And sometimes growing up doesn't mean staying quiet. It means knowing when to speak up." I felt a warmth rise in my chest. "But," she added, "you still need distance. Emotion is a fire. If you don't respect the space between you and it, it will burn down the very thing you're trying to build." I nodded. This time I had no argument. She closed the manuscript and held it against her chest for a moment, almost as if feeling it through her heart instead of her hands. "Keep writing. But don't forget, it's the silence that allows you to truly hear the voices of those who've been unheard." I left her office feeling like I'd walked through a rainstorm made of ideas. On my way back, I passed the small campus chapel, a quiet space I often visited when I needed to clear my mind. It was empty. Only a single candle flickered near the statue of the Virgin Mary. I sat in the third pew, fingers interlaced, not in prayer but in stillness. I closed my eyes. And there she was again, my mother. Smiling. Her crow's feet deepening at the corners of her eyes. She wore a familiar gray sweater and held a cup of tea. It was so vivid, so real, it felt like if I reached out I could touch her. When I opened my eyes, there was a white daisy resting on the bench beside me. I hadn't heard footsteps. No creaking door. No breeze. Just that single flower. The same kind that had been printed on my mother's apron years ago. I stared at it for a long time. My hand trembled as I picked it up. It wasn't fragrant. It wasn't bright. Just a plain, humble flower, but pure and unmistakably her. And I knew he had been there. No ghostly figure. No disembodied voice. Just a small sign, a quiet, undeniable presence that whispered, "I see you. I'm proud. I understand." I closed my eyes again and whispered inside, "I won't let the fire in me destroy anything, Mom. I'll turn it into light." I gently placed the daisy into my notebook, pressing it between two blank pages meant for ideas I hadn't yet written. That evening, I returned to my room and turned on the soft yellow lamp by the window. I didn't work. I didn't write. I just sat there looking at the city lights blink and fade. Life continued, busy, chaotic, full of untold stories. But inside I knew I had just entered a new chapter. One where reason and feeling no longer fought each other, but walked hand in hand. Where I wasn't just a researcher anymore, but a daughter inheriting the quiet strength of a woman who once moved through life unseen. In the weeks that followed, I began my journey, collecting the stories of those who often go unnoticed. I went to nursing homes, small diners, and hospitals. I sat with old men and women who no longer had visitors. I sat with workers who spent their days sweeping floors, cleaning windows, and flipping burgers. People whose lives were often deemed insignificant. It felt odd at first. To ask strangers to share their lives, their memories, and their pain. But I soon realized, these voices, though quiet, were not weak. They held the essence of years gone by, of lives spent enduring and giving. And each one was a thread, weaving a tapestry of shared humanity. My first stop was at a small, dilapidated nursing home on the outskirts of the city. The building was old and time there moved slower. The air smelled of antiseptic and forgotten memories. There I met James Holloway, an 83-year-old man, once a railroad worker, now a resident of the home. He sat by the window, bathed in the pale afternoon light, his hands trembling slightly as he held a cup of tea. "You know," he said in a low voice, "people remember doctors, engineers, but no one remembers the switchmen on the trains. I spent 37 years working a small station directing trains that I never got to ride." I sat there listening. And as I listened, I saw the rough calluses on his hands, the traces of a life that had never been glorified or celebrated. His words weren't just words. They were a testament to a lifetime of dedication, a lifetime of being invisible. "But now you're sitting here writing down my story," he continued, his voice softening. "You've made me feel like I matter." I felt a lump in my throat. Not because of his words, but because I suddenly saw my mother in him. The quiet lives of people who had never been given the chance to be seen. Over the next few days I met more people. A hospital janitor who had been cleaning the same hospital floor for 35 years. A waitress who had spent decades serving the same dishes with a tired smile. An elderly cook in a family-owned restaurant who had never left her tiny kitchen. They all had stories. Simple ones sometimes, but real. Full of sacrifice, perseverance, and unnoticed grace. They spoke in fragments, interruptions, pauses, half-formed sentences, but I heard them. And more importantly, I felt them. Every conversation was a piece of a puzzle I had long been trying to solve. How do we learn to truly see each other? And then one night something unusual happened. It was late, around 3 a.m., and I was still working in my room trying to finish my thesis. My fingers were cramped and my mind was foggy from hours of writing. I leaned back, closing my eyes for a moment, and then I heard it. A whisper. "Lena." It wasn't a voice I could place. It was soft, distant, almost as if it were coming from a dream. I opened my eyes, feeling an odd sense of peace wash over me. I shook it off, attributing it to the exhaustion. But as I resumed working, the sensation lingered. This feeling that I was being watched over. That somehow someone was there with me, guiding me. The next day, I met a woman at the diner I frequented for coffee. She was older, with graying hair pulled into a tight bun. Her apron was faded, and her hands were rough from years of work. She looked at me as I stepped up to the counter, and before I could speak, she smiled. "You know, child," she said, her voice soft but clear, "there's something about you. You've got a light in your eyes, the kind of light that comes when you live for something bigger than yourself." I froze, my heart skipping a beat. It was the same feeling, the same strange pull that had come over me the night before. I looked at her, unsure of how to respond. But she wasn't finished. "People like us," she continued, "we don't always get to shine. But that light, No one can take it from you if you don't let them. I stared at her, feeling an overwhelming wave of recognition. I didn't know her. I had never seen her before. But there she was, speaking words that felt like they came from somewhere deep inside me. The moment passed quickly. She handed me my coffee with a kind smile and I left the diner, my mind racing. Was this another sign? Another whisper? I couldn't be sure. But something told me to keep listening. The days began to blend together as I collected more stories, more voices. I kept encountering people who spoke in riddles, in symbols, as though the universe itself was trying to get through to me. One afternoon I found myself in a small cafe in town. It wasn't busy, and the only other person there was a middle-aged man sitting in the corner, scribbling in a notebook. I sat down at the counter, ordering a cup of tea. The man glanced up, his tired eyes meeting mine for a moment before he returned to his writing. For reasons I couldn't explain, I felt compelled to approach him. "Mind if I ask what you're writing?" I inquired. He paused, his pen hovering over the page. Then with a sigh, he closed the notebook and looked up at me. "It's about memories," he said, his voice carrying a weight I couldn't quite place. "I'm trying to remember all the people I've met over the years. All the stories they've shared with me. It's funny, you know? How we only really start listening when we realize how much time we've wasted not paying attention." I nodded, unsure how to respond. But then he said something that stayed with me long after I left. "You know, sometimes we're all just trying to be remembered. We think it's all about the big moments. But it's the little things that matter. The whispers, the quiet moments that no one notices." As I left the cafe, I couldn't help but feel the weight of his words settle deep inside me. I thought about the people I had met, their stories, their struggles, their quiet lives. And I realized something important. In listening to them, I wasn't just remembering their stories. I was also healing mine. I had no way of knowing what these encounters meant, or if they meant anything at all. But I began to see connections, threads that tied everything together. My mother. The strangers I met. The whispers from the unseen. It was as if the world was opening up to me in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't just about academic analysis. It was about hearing. Truly hearing. And I knew, whatever path I walked, whatever I learned, I would always carry these moments with me. The quiet moments that spoke the loudest. As the days turned into weeks, I began to feel as though something greater was taking shape around me. It was as if all these moments, these encounters, were threads in a vast tapestry, each one seemingly insignificant on its own, yet forming a larger picture that I couldn't fully see yet. I started to look at the world differently. No longer just a cashier, no longer just a student, but as someone who was listening, truly listening. And in that listening, I felt a connection to something I couldn't explain. Something far beyond the simple words people said. It was the quiet understanding between souls that could never truly be articulated. One afternoon, I found myself walking through the city's oldest park. The trees were thick with autumn leaves, their colors a fiery mix of red, orange, and gold. The air was crisp and the ground was soft underfoot. I walked with no destination, just the need to feel something deep and grounding. As I wandered, I found a bench beneath a large oak tree, the kind of tree whose branches stretch out like arms reaching for the sky. I sat there for a long while, just watching the people pass by, each lost in their own world, their own thoughts. And that's when I noticed him. An older man, probably in his 70s, sitting alone on the other side of the bench. His eyes were closed, his hands resting on his knees, and his breathing slow and steady. I didn't want to disturb him, but something about his stillness felt familiar. So after a few moments, I gently spoke up. "Are you okay?" I asked. He opened his eyes slowly and smiled. "Yes," he said softly, "I'm just waiting." "Waiting for what?" asked curious. "Waiting for the next story," he replied, his voice like a breeze through the leaves. "I'm a storyteller. I listen to the world. And I wait for the next story to find me." I sat in silence, unsure how to respond. But there was something about the way he said it. Something that resonated deep within me. It felt like the answer to something I had been seeking. I said after a moment, I'm a storyteller too. But I didn't know it until recently. The old man turned his head toward me, his eyes sharp despite his age. Everyone has a story, child. You just have to listen. I looked at him for a long time, the weight of his words settling in my chest. For the first time I realized that in all my research, in all my writing, I hadn't been just gathering data. I had been collecting lives. And in doing so, I had begun to weave my own story. I began to record everything. Not just the stories of others but my own thoughts, my own feelings. I wrote down every encounter, every whisper, every moment of connection. It wasn't just for my thesis anymore. It was for me. For healing. I couldn't ignore it any longer. The way my life was becoming intertwined with the lives of those I had listened to. Their struggles, their joys, their pain. It was all merging with my own. And in that merging I found a strange sense of peace. My mother's voice, her wisdom, still echoed in my mind. It had been there all along, in every story I had heard, in every face I had seen. She had never been truly gone. She had been with me in every step I took, in every choice I made. I began to understand the full meaning of what she had taught me. Kindness is strength. Understanding is power. And silence is where the truth can be found. One evening I sat in my room, the window open to the cool night air, and I realized something. I had become part of the tapestry. All the voices I had heard, all the stories I had collected, were not just isolated fragments. They were threads woven together, forming a picture that was constantly evolving. My journey, my mother's journey, the journeys of the people I met, they were all connected. And in that connection I found my purpose. The light from the street lamps outside flickered, casting soft shadows across my notebook, where the words I had written now felt alive. Every sentence, every paragraph was more than just research. It was a reflection of everything I had learned and everything I had become. I closed my eyes, and in that moment I felt the presence of my mother. Not physically, but in every thought, every memory, every moment that had shaped me. She was with me, guiding me, helping me see the truth in the world around me. Thank you, Mom, I whispered, my voice full of gratitude. You've shown me how to listen, how to see, how to love. Days passed and my thesis came together. It wasn't the thesis I had initially planned. It wasn't just an academic paper. It was a testament to everything I had experienced, everything I had learned. The voices of the unheard had shaped it. And in return they had shaped me. The day I finally submitted my thesis, I stood outside the office where the final paperwork was being processed, my heart racing. It wasn't about the degree anymore. It wasn't about the recognition. It was about understanding. It was about listening. As I walked back to my apartment that evening, the sun setting behind me, I realized that I had found my way. My path wasn't defined by grades or accolades. It was defined by the lives I had touched and the lives that had touched me. My name is Lena Carter. I used to be a cashier, standing behind the counter with a smile that hid my exhaustion. I used to think that life was a series of disconnected moments, of people passing by. But now I know better. Every life, every story, is a thread in a much bigger tapestry. And the more we listen, the more we see, the more we realize that we are all connected by love, by pain, and by the quiet moments that speak the loudest. 3 months later the day arrived. I stood in front of the lecture hall, my hands slightly trembling as I adjusted my notes. The room was filled with students, professors, and professionals who had come to listen to a series of graduate student presentations. It was a small conference, but the weight of it still felt immense. I was the last to present. There were no data charts in my presentation. No graphs. No statistical models. There were only stories. I had rewritten my thesis several times since the last revision. I had changed the approach. I had brought it into the realm of the personal and the human, merging theory with lived experience. I had taken everything I had learned, about psychology, about people, about myself, and woven it into something real. I'm here today, I began, my voice steady, though my heart was racing, not to share a study but to share a journey. The room fell silent, as if everyone was listening intently, waiting for the words that would follow. I've spent the last several months listening to the stories of people who are rarely heard. The ones who serve, who clean, who care for others without ever asking for recognition. And I've realized something important. Every single person has a story worth telling. And in every one of those stories, there is a thread that ties us all together. I spoke of the elderly man I met in the park, of the janitor who worked in silence, of the waitress with the fading smile, and the countless others whose lives were woven into the tapestry of my research. I told them about my mother and how her quiet strength had shaped my understanding of the world. I don't study narcissism because I want to define it, I continued. I study it because I've seen it in action in real life, in the anger and frustration of people who feel small and powerless. But I've also seen the opposite, the quiet acts of kindness that change lives, that break the cycle of anger. And that's what I want to explore. The power of listening. The power of being heard. I spoke for a while longer, recounting the countless stories that had shaped me. And when I finished, there was a moment of stillness. No one moved. No one spoke. And then, the applause came. It wasn't loud. It wasn't thunderous. But it was there. Gentle like a warm breeze. As I stood at the front of the room, I felt a deep sense of peace settle over me. I hadn't just completed a thesis. I had completed a journey. One that had started long before I ever sat down to write those first words. It had started with the whispers of the forgotten, with the voices of those who had never been truly seen. But now I could see them. I could hear them. And in doing so, I had finally found myself. That evening, as I sat in my apartment, I looked out the window at the city below. The lights flickered like tiny stars in the distance, each one representing a person, a life, a story. And I realized we're all connected. Every one of us. Through our struggles, our triumphs, our silent moments of understanding. The world is a vast and intricate tapestry, and we are all threads, woven together in ways we may never fully understand. But if we listen closely, if we are open to the quiet whispers that surround us, we can begin to see the bigger picture. Thought of my mother. Of her quiet wisdom. Of how she had never asked for anything more than to be understood. She had taught me without words that the greatest strength lies not in being seen, but in seeing others. I closed my eyes and whispered into the night. Thank you, Mom, for showing me the way. The next morning I woke up early before the sun had risen. I grabbed my bag, my notebook, and my pen. I wasn't heading to campus. I wasn't heading to another interview or presentation. I was heading to a place that had been calling to me for some time now. I walked through the quiet streets, the morning air cool and crisp, until I reached the old park. The oak tree was still there, its branches reaching toward the sky like arms welcoming me back. I sat on the same bench where I had met the old man. The one who had taught me about stories. The one who had shown me that the next story was always waiting for me to listen. I closed my eyes, breathed in the fresh air, and let the silence wash over me. And in that silence I heard something. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't a whisper. But it was something else. Something deep, something powerful. You are not alone. I opened my eyes and smiled. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting golden light across the park. The world was still. And for the first time I felt truly at peace. I knew I had found my place in the tapestry. I knew I had found my voice.